Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in this fine world. You are listening to the Startup Selling Show, talking sales with Scott Sambucci. That's me. Today's episode is one of those episodes where I was the interviewee on another podcast. So recently I was interviewed by Scott Cowley, he runs what's called the Sales Mastermind. So he's based in the UK and he works with consultants and agencies and other service-based businesses to help them with their sales process. And as part of his business, he has a podcast just like we do here at Sales Qualia. And we got in touch on LinkedIn, was introduced to him, and he asked me, hey, would you mind coming on as a guest and sharing some of your perspectives around sales process? What are some of the mistakes that founders make and early stage growth companies make? Because whether you're a CFO for hire, you're an agency or some kind of service-based business, oftentimes the same sales challenges that his clients are facing are often the same ones that our clients in the startup tech world hit as well. So in the course of the conversation, he asked me a couple of really fun questions that I love to answer, and I wanted to share some of my perspectives on how to be thinking about sales with you. And so let me just give you a little preview of some of the questions to listen for over the course of our conversation. First of all, one of the questions that we answered was, what is it that most founders don't know about sales? We talked about how sales is a process, and we also talked about why you should never think about closing the sale, and why we here in our company and with our clients in our startup selling coaching program, we teach our clients never use the word close. And I explain why that is in the course of our conversation. We spent a lot of time talking about implementation as part of the sale. So just because you get a contract signed doesn't mean the sale is finished. It means really that the sale is just starting. And that relates to the idea of that, avoiding that word close of the sale. We talked about how to avoid proposals. We talked about how to lead the sale. We had a really interesting part of a conversation where I talked about how, if you're doing your sales, if you've built a correct sales process, you're actually never really selling at all. Everything from lead generation all the way through to the time that your prospects sign a contract with you. If you do this the right way, you're actually never selling, which is pretty awesome if you think about it. We talked about mistakes that founders make when it comes to building out their sales process. And then we also talked about when and how to start finding some repeatability in your sales process so that you can start to hire and grow your sales team. The last thing we talked about is how sales should be about 6 months ahead of product, especially when you're selling to the enterprise, simply because of the long sales cycles and what it takes in order to get those early customers and early implementation. So had a lot of fun with the conversation, lots of back and forth with Scott Cowley, who's kind enough to share the recording with us so that I could share it with you. So any or all of these topics are interesting for you and you want to get my perspectives on how I think about these things and how I think about your sales process, you should listen on. So that's it for now. Let's head over to my conversation with Scott Cowley. See ya.
Hey guys, so welcome to the call. We got a pretty exciting one here. I'm really, really excited to introduce Scott Sambucci. He's a startup coach, speaker, best-selling author, and he helps early-stage B2B startups to grow revenue and build a repeatable sales process. Scott also lives in North California with his wife and son, and apparently Ironmen are too short for him these days. He focuses only on ultra running. Scott, thanks so much for jumping on today, man.
Oh man, I can't believe you just told people I said that. So yeah, the joke, I actually brought this up as a joke with somebody who was like a 10-time Ironman because he saw I was a 3-time Ironman. And he said, why don't you do Ironmans anymore? And I joked with him. I said, well, they're too short because you can get done in 12 hours. I like to do ultra marathons, which take like 24 hours, or I've done some 200-mile races that take 72 hours plus. So I don't know if he took too kindly to the joke. I was trying to be like kind of funny, but it was one of those things where I think he felt like I was like trying to raise the testosterone level or something. But anyway, but yeah, man, it's good to be here. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Man, thanks for jumping on. I think it probably aligns with working with startups. It's an Ironman's too short. An ultra marathon is really what it is.
It's a never-ending race with no finish line.
Fantastic, dude. Well, look, I asked you on today because you've obviously got the experience the audience is looking for, but I think you had a really awesome kind of theory and structure around what most people don't know about selling as a startup. I really love kind of when you're thinking about selling as a startup, what are some of the mistakes that people make because they just don't know any better?
Yeah, it's like the $1 million, $10 million, or $100 million question, depending on what kind of startup you want to be. And I think I think the biggest mistake people make is forgetting that they have to sell. I think whether you're, say, a consultant who's been in the business for 20 years and you've got a big network, or you're a very specific topic expert like a CFO who's doing CFO as a service, or you're a software company, right? You're an engineer, you've built a great product. I think in all three of those cases, it's easy to fall into the trap that, well, I'm really have a lot of experience in this industry, or I've got this specialized knowledge, or we've built this wonderful product. All of these things should enable people to see why they should work with me. And, regardless of where you are in that spectrum, the biggest mistake people forget is like the number one thing you got to do to grow is to get really good at selling your stuff. So that's the number one mistake people make.
Yeah, for sure. It's amazing, the whole build it and they will come. I think most people, once they start a business, they realize that it doesn't exist, but it can take a long time before people actually do start selling. And that's what I think is, as kind of sales coaches and sales trainers, it's something that I struggle with, having that initial conversation and really focusing on like, no, you actually have to kind of pound the pavement. How do you kind of help people understand, let's say they're really early stage and they have kind of lucked themselves into those first few clients, which, let's be honest, that's usually what happens. How do you start helping them? Where do you normally start?
So I think the way to think about, like the way we think about this with our clients, we typically work with B2B tech software startups, right? I'm in Northern California, lots of startups, obviously in Silicon Valley, but we have clients all over the world. And whenever we're working with them, we sort of bring them through this model that we call idea to impact. So like, think about any entrepreneur, right? You or me or anybody running a company, every company starts literally with this idea. You're like, hey, there's a problem in the market that needs to be solved. Nobody else is solving it. I want to build this product, solve this problem. And ultimately, if you're a good-hearted person, the real reason that you're doing this isn't just to like make a bunch of money. It's that you want to make an impact. You want to help people with the problem that they're suffering from every day. And so in that journey, there's kind of three distinct phases that we have found. The first is the true startup phase, like going out to market, getting those first couple of customers through network or introductions or hustle and hard work, maybe some luck. So you've got those first few customers, you got revenue coming in the door. And then the next phase is where things get really tough, because that's where you have to start thinking through, what are the systems that I need to be running across my sales process that are going to allow me to get some repeatability and predictability around sales, right? So think about that consultant or the CFO or even a software company, right? Like, I have to be thinking about, how do I generate leads? How do I do my prospecting? That's got to be a system. Once I get a lead, how do I march them through our sales process to get them from interested to buying? And then once I have them as a customer, how do I implement with them and make sure they're happy and renew them and upsell them down the road? And so getting into that mindset of thinking of sales as a system is really usually pretty surprising to people. Sort of, especially if you've not done sales as a career like I have, is sort of the perception of sales is like, there's some black box there, or I just hire some enterprise sales guy and like he knows how to do sales. It's some magical power. And it's not. There's a process to it. And the sooner you can start to define your sales process for your company, the sooner that you can really start to grow out of startup phase and get into what we call the second phase, which is ramp up phase.
Yeah, cool. I love that. I love especially how you talk about that the sale doesn't end with the yes and the cash. It ends with the impact. It ends with them actually getting the outcome they want. Is that did that kind of come from experience? Was that kind of you noticed a churn issue when that doesn't happen, or why did you guys settle on that model?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't get asked that question too often, and it's insightful that you picked up on that. It came from a couple of different places, and I think it all converged like a lot of ideas. So number one is I read a book a long time ago, about 25 years ago. I read a book by a guy named Neil Rackham. It's a book called Major Account Sales Strategy. And some people might be familiar with Neil Rackham's other book called Spin Selling, which is a questioning technique. But he actually wrote a second book that is not as well known, but still is a very good book. And he's a very data-driven person, and he did thousands of interviews and analysis across the sales process. And what he found is that there are actually 4 main stages to an enterprise sale. The first is needs analysis, figuring out, okay, what's the problem here? The second is evaluation of options. Okay, we've got this problem. What are options to fix it? Do we buy from this vendor or that vendor? Do we do it ourselves? Do we hire a consultant? What are the options available? The third is then what he calls resolution of concerns, which is, okay, we have these options, but which is the right one? How do we know this one's going to work? How do we know it's going to work with our current systems? And then the fourth, he identified as what he called implementation. And because we're selling to other enterprises, just because somebody signs the contract, that's really just the starting line to the relationship. In fact, with our clients, we refuse to use the word close. I don't let people think about closing the sale because it's really just starting the relationship. In fact, that's what the client says when they want to move forward, right? What do they say to you? Let's get started. Let's move forward. They never say, hey, you just closed the sale. And so that what most salespeople perceive as being a finishing line is really just the starting line to that implementation, to that relationship. And with large enterprise sales, some of these implementations can take 6 months, 12 months or longer. And I saw this myself firsthand when I was a VP of sales at Blend. So Blend is a lending software platform. It was first started back in 2013, 14 when I was first head of sales. Our first customers, it took us 6 months to implement the initial round of workflows because we were in such early stage with the product. We're still trying to figure out this product market fit. And so much of the every single day when I was on site or flying to Dallas, I was literally like reselling to the VPs and the senior vice presidents and the chief risk officers. Why are you doing this, right? Because they're investing time and people and resources and money without really seeing results. And so even though you get the contract signed, even though you might get paid, you still got some selling to do because there's a chance that if you lose that customer in those initial implementation stages, especially, but before they even see results, they could pull the plug and then just move on. And so I sort of thought of it first, principally from this book, and then secondly, through personal experience when you're implementing with some of the largest banks in the world, some of the workflow software that we had built out.
So kind of from that example there, where you're constantly reiterating the sale and constantly keeping in touch and then moving and constantly kind of building that up. I have a question around how do you make sure you set the right expectations at the right time so that it doesn't get to month 5 and they're kind of so close. How do you structure that in a sales conversation?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things we teach all the time to our clients, especially in the enterprise world. You're selling $50K, $100K. We have some clients selling $1 million products, right? With some of the biggest companies in the world. And there's always this, first of all, for those companies to say yes to any large sale, there's always going to be lots of reasons to say no, right? They're going to look for reasons. Oh, you don't integrate with such and such system, or gosh, it might take a long time to train, or geez, we're just coming out of some COVID, situation that's slowing us down, or gosh, your buttons are blue instead of red. If only the buttons were blue, then it would be so much easier to use your product, right? They come up with all these reasons why they can't use it. And most importantly, especially as you're starting to grow your company as a startup, there's this perception of risk. They're already nervous about spending $1 million. They're already nervous about their own social, political, career capital that they're going to be spending, not just the money, but themselves, whether they buy from you or IBM or Oracle, right? They're going to make that decision. That's why there's the old saying, nobody ever got fired for buying an IBM, right? It was the idea that there's no risk by buying IBM. So now you're in the situation as a startup, you want to sell your product. You know you can solve that problem, but the buyer is like, oh, we're so close, but gosh, I'm really worried. Like, how do I know you can do all the things you say you're going to do? And so one of the things we teach to our clients is as part of the sale, we actually bring implementation forward. We include it early in the sales process and almost map it out for the client to get them really, really clear. Like, hey, before we even talk about a contract, before we talk through when to get started, let's take a couple weeks and sit down with people on your side that we know are going to need help from, IT people, security people that are going to be using the software every day, and people on our side, sales engineers, product people, folks on our side. And let's just map out what an implementation would look like over the first week, the first month, the first quarter, so that you can get really, really clear on how you're going to get the results that we're promising to you. And by moving that implementation plan forward, then what that does is it reduces that perception of risk. People can see, they're like, oh, this is how you're going to execute on this software. And in a lot of ways, even though they're spending money for the product, they're actually buying the plan. The plan is like the tangible thing that gets them the result they want. Solve this problem, earn this revenue, reduce these costs, increase this efficiency. The plan is what shows them how you're going to do it. And that's the thing they buy into. And so you want to move that forward early into the conversation. Like, we recommend doing it just right after an initial product demo. Start talking about implementation. So it's not some after contract conversation, it's actually part of your sales process.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you've pulled it forward. But the fact that you also talk about involving them heavily in the plan. So you kind of, one thing I love about sales, and one thing that I think a lot of people mess up, especially when they're first getting started, is they think that it's at every opportunity I have to be getting money. I have to be getting a yes. And what I love is that you've kind of broken down and pulled that away and said, well, we don't need you to say yes right now. We just need to do this next step, the implementation plan. And then it's such a natural, based on what you're telling me, just a natural, well, we've already got the plan. So of course we're going to move forward. How do you take that conversation, and how do you, someone's potentially like resistant to having it that early? They want to do a traditional buying process and tender and all that. How would you take that conversation and take them out of their process and put them into your buying process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, we had this situation. We have one of the clients we work with. They sell to large retailers, very large retailers, Fortune 500 type retailers. And this often happens when these large companies, because they have a very specific procurement process, or like you call it, a buying process. This is how they buy stuff. And so one of the things that one of our clients did is they said, look, like, I know you want a proposal for to review and bring through your procurement department. We want to get you a proposal. There's nothing we enjoy more than sending a proposal to somebody who's interested in buying from us. But here's the thing. We don't know exactly what to put into the proposal because we have some open questions. We could implement in phases. For example, we might roll out with your stores in California and then the whole country. We might look at certain ways of like turning certain parts of the product on first and then another part of the product later. We don't exactly know what your usage might be like, how many people are going to be using the platform every day. So we have a lot of these open questions. We haven't seen on the backside, like, you want to be able to have data flows from your system to our system. Like we haven't even done like an audit of your systems to know what the connectors need to look like from a technical standpoint. So yeah, like, we'd love to put together a proposal. In order for us to create the proposal for you to evaluate, we just need to answer a couple of these questions first, so that whatever we put in that document is going to be accurate. Otherwise, we're going to send you a document, and if it happens to be right, it's going to be just pure dumb luck. But chances are there's going to be something in that proposal that doesn't match up with what you need. And then you're going to either say, yes, we want to go forward. And when then we start implementing, we realize we have to make all these changes, and you're going to get mad. Or you're going to say, no, we don't want to work with you. And turns out maybe there was a way for us to actually solve your problem. We just didn't know the answers to some of these questions. So you're saying yes to the proposal. And the way to get you the proposal you want is just to answer a couple of these questions. And that most people, when you explain it to them that way, they go, you know what, you're absolutely right. That makes sense. Now, occasionally you're going to have some of those very rigid RFP processes or very rigid buyers like, you know what, just do your best, send it to me, we'll look it over and we'll let you know. But my experience has been when you just have that human-to-human conversation with people and say, look, we know you want to get the best proposal. We want to give you the best proposal. It just seems like it would make sense to at least have a couple of quick calls to understand the answers to these questions so that we can get you the right information. Does that seem reasonable? And of course, nobody wants to seem unreasonable. So that's the way that we sort of coach our clients to approach that situation. A second thing we've done, which is another client of ours that sells an international payments platform. I love that they did this because they're selling to banks, relatively large banks that are doing international payments. They work with mid-sized, those banks that have mid-sized manufacturers that are, selling products overseas. So you can imagine like this financial, transaction happening overseas. They have this payment system that allows that payment to happen super quick, like within hours instead of weeks. And so one of the challenges they had was that the banks have this very rigid process. So they actually, what they did is they created a how we work document. So early in the sales process, they actually outlined kind of like, these are the rules of engagement if you want to work with us. When we do product demos, we don't do single product demos with one person. We always do product demos in groups because we know that there's going to be multiple people that have multiple perspectives. We don't send proposals, but we'll build a custom work plan for you. And they basically like created almost like the commandments of how to work with us. And now they use that in the sales process, and it is working fantastically well because now the buyer is realizing like, oh, these guys are different. They're not just like everyone else. And it really helped them set themselves apart and actually create a better relationship because they've been much more transparent about their process and what they need from the buyer if the buyer is serious about actually considering them as an option to solve their problem.
Because I love that document you just described. I love that this is how you work with us. It's amazing how responsive buyers are to being led like that. Even from my experience, kind of the 1,000-person company CEO is like, oh, okay, that's how I work with you. I don't have to put any thought into my internal processes and pushing stuff through. That's the rules. Okay, those are the rules. Let's play by those. And it's amazing how you draw that back down to kind of sort of the people I work with. One of the things I teach people is record your sales calls. And it shocks me how many people get scared and go, well, how do I ask for that? How do I ask for something as simple as, can I hit record on Zoom? And then you're kind of, well, what I love, by the way, the process you just described, I love it so much, but it's amazing how when you level up your thinking and you think about at like a really, really strategic level, this is how to work with us, and you set the rules, you're going to have an opportunity really early on to dictate how this conversation is going to happen. While also kind of in part one of what you were talking about there, when they push back, just saying, well, those were the rules you agreed to. What was I think your word was, does that sound reasonable? I love that, man. I love that.
Does that sound reasonable? So I learned that from a friend of mine named Chris Duggan, who has started multiple companies. Chris was he was the first sales VP at WebEx, grew them to like $100 million in sales. He's advised Palantir. He's started his own company. I've learned stuff from him. And when I was the head of sales at Blend, he was an advisor. And I said, hey man, do you mind coming in and working with me and the team just to give us some your perspectives? And he's the one, he shared this with me. He's like, just ask them, does that sound reasonable? Because of course, does that sound reasonable? Like who wants to be, no, I don't want to be reasonable. I want to be an unreasonable dolt right now and make it hard for all of us. So it's some great psychology there that I learned from him.
Hey folks, we're off and running in my conversation with me. So one of the things I want to make sure that you do, if you're a first-time listener to the podcast, make sure that you do subscribe and tell a friend or 10 about the podcast. Viral is still the very best way for our podcast numbers to grow and grow and grow. It's one of the things that we love to do. We check those metrics every single month because we want to know that the content that we're pumping out is content that people want to hear. And we're seeing the numbers go up. Nothing jazzes us more than see those numbers come up, and it's thanks to you. So when you subscribe, when you leave a review, when you share podcast with a friend or 10, liking it on LinkedIn, if you've seen this post on LinkedIn or you see it on Twitter and you share that with your group of followers, it helps us get exposure to people who may not otherwise have found us. So please do share the podcast with a friend or 10, leave us a review, tell us how we're doing, give us some ideas for guests or topics. I would do a podcast every day if we had the time. So no shortage of ideas coming from you. So keep those coming. Let us know what we can do to make the show even better. Second thing I'll ask you to do, that if you haven't so far, make sure you download a copy of my latest book, Stop Hustling, Start Scaling. So it's a book that we published last year, hit number 1 on the Amazon new release list. And the book is called Stop Hustling, Start Scaling. You can grab a full and complete personal copy of the book over on our salesqualia.com website. So if you go to salesqualia, QUALIA.com, right there at the homepage, there's a button where it says download free copy. Click that button, pop in your email address, and we will email you a full personal copy of the book, totally for free. That will also add you to our email list, so you'll find out about trainings that we're doing. I'm doing more and more LinkedIn lives. We're letting our email list know the schedule of when we're doing those lives so you don't miss them, especially if it's about a topic that's important to you. Recently, we've done some LinkedIn lives around different sales, specifically around the 9 sales accelerators. We've done some LinkedIn Lives around sales hiring and sales hiring mistakes that founders tend to make. We've got a whole list of topics that we're going to be covering over the coming months, and we're going to be covering those on LinkedIn Lives. And one of the best ways to find out about when and which topics we're going to be covering is get a copy of the book, Stop Hustling, Start Scaling, so you can get added to our email list. So that's it for now. Let's head back to my conversation, or Scott Cowley's conversation with me, as I was getting interviewed on his podcast, The Sales Mastermind.
Yeah, sweet, man. I have a bit of a left field question. Kind of based on your experience and what you've been talking about, you're obviously an incredibly strategic guy. And I want to know, one, if that came naturally, because personally, I find a lot of the founders that I deal with can get really stuck in the trenches. But some of the things you've described so far, like proper strategy and like serious forethought, did that come naturally? And if not, how did you learn it? Or how do you explain that to people who it doesn't necessarily come naturally to?
Yeah. So it's the nature versus nurture argument here. Which side are we on? So here's a couple of ways that I've thought about this. So number one, like on a personal level, when I've taken behavioral assessments, for example, I'm off the charts analytical. That's just the way I am. In fact, I've taken 3 assessments just to make sure. It's like, I just want to make sure that this one is right. So I'll take 2 more just to make sure it's accurate. That's just the way I think. And I've always been that way, just, elementary school, grade school, high school. I've always been process oriented, sports oriented, go to practice, work hard, train extra. I've always had that in me. What I found though, when I moved into the business world and I started selling, I had, having an outside sales territory when I was 22 years old. This is in the mid 90s, right? So basically, like, these are your accounts. Get a map, literally a map, put it on the wall, put pins where your accounts are, and every day, every week, you have to plan your route. Like, what accounts am I going to go to? Where am I going to spend that time? If I go to this account, then I can also spend the afternoon over here. And then the sales that I was doing, I used to sell college textbooks for Pearson Education. And so that process in itself is a very regimented process at university. So any large class, like a general chemistry class or intro to economics, there are committees of professors that are getting involved with the decisions on what books to use, because you have 1,000 students taking these classes. And so inherently, I stepped into a role where I was forced to think very process-wise. Okay, this professor wants this thing. The next step is to have the subject matter expert come in and do a presentation, uncover objections, all of that stuff. So I sort of got lucky in that I found an early role in my career that matched my personality. Now, if we fast forward now to what we're doing, what we're talking about, if you're trying to build your sales process, if we match that with this idea of an implementation plan and being very regimented, if you think about the sales process, if you do it the right way, right? Let's say however you generate leads, it's on LinkedIn, or you're doing some email marketing, or however you're generating leads. Are you really doing any selling there or not? Not really. I mean, you should be adding some value. You're trying to get people interested in what you do. You're not really selling them on anything. You're just trying to create a conversation, right? Then you get in a conversation. What do you do there? Are you really selling anything? You shouldn't be. What you should be doing is asking questions about their problem. Like, why are you interested in seeing the product? Why are you interested in talking with us about being a CFO for hire? So you're just uncovering information. It's research, right? Then when you go to show your product and talk about your services, are you really selling? Not really. What you're really doing is showing, okay, you have this problem. We have this product or solution. Let's just show you how it maps to your problem, right? And they go, okay, yeah, that looks like it works. Then you come out of that call and you start talking about implementation. Are you really selling? Not really. You're just kind of project managing at this point. You're like, well, we got to talk to the IT people. We got to talk to the risk people. Procurement folks are probably going to have some questions. Let's get you some documentation. Let's answer those questions. And then if it's a fit, then we can move forward to a contract. So we talk about the sales process, but when I think about the sales process, if you're doing it right, you're actually not doing any selling at all. You should never feel like you're selling or pitching to somebody. And I personal experience, when I'm out there talking to founders who want to join our coaching program, every once in a while, I'll have somebody who I want to join the program more than they want to join. And I get this little selling voice that starts coming out of my mouth. and I can hear it as I'm saying it. And it's like, you know, when you hear yourself on a podcast or audio recording, you're like, oh, is that the way my voice sounds? Oh, I don't like the sound of my voice. It's the same way. If I ever feel like I'm selling, that little voice, that change in my voice, it's like, oh no, I'm doing the selling voice again. No, I don't want to do the selling voice, right? So you think about this, like the sales process is really just like finding people who have a problem, figuring out if you can solve that problem, talking through how you might work together to actually implement to get the results they want. There's not a whole lot of selling in there. There's lots of nuance and technique and tactical stuff that you have to do to get the meeting and follow up on all that stuff. But when you talk about this kind of selling, there's not a lot of selling involved.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting how you talked about the voice in the back of your head, because I have a very good friend of mine who listens to me whenever I run calls. He often says, Scott, you're doing it again. Because I don't even notice that I do it. When you, like, I'm chairing a meeting or something, there's that voice that comes out, and it's just, yeah. I love how you describe as well there. You kind of take through, as long as you know what the steps are. Yeah, there's tools and tactics, but there's not really that much sales. And it's amazing how, like, founders who are technically skilled in some capacity, they can do a thing and they can do it really well. Often when they think of sales, they think of the snake oil salesman or the used car dealer.
Yeah.
Man, how much would it suck to be a used car dealer who's honest? That's just not the world I'd want to be in. But that's what they think about. Or the quick talking phone sales guy at the local big box store. And they kind of have that fear. They don't want to be that person. Whereas it sounds like taking the process and really boiling it down. You don't have to be that person. You're just really solving the problem of get to the next step.
Yeah, exactly right. And like the technique comes into, for example, if you're doing outbound emails to people, there's a wrong way to do it and there's a right way to do it. We all know the wrong way because we all get the emails in our inbox or the emails in our inbox that are horrible and crappy. And can I grab 30 minutes of your time, or can I book a call, blah, 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 right? So that's the wrong way. The right way is, how do I add value to people? How do I get them to sort themselves and say, look, this is not a good time, versus being willing to engage? How do I create ways for people to engage that doesn't have to mean a call? You know, can I run a webinar and invite people to a webinar instead of trying to get them on a call? Can I send them a blog post? Can I run a podcast and get people listening to the way I think about the problem? So that's the right way, you know. Same thing with product demos. Like if you get later in the sales process, well, people say, well, product demos, I always book an hour for product demos because there's so much product to show. I'm like, well, what if you did it the other way? What if you only had 5 minutes? What would you show? They say, well, that would be really hard because I wouldn't know what part of the product to show. And I'm like, exactly. So what we need to do before you get into the demo is, like, let's have a chat with somebody. Let's figure out what their problems are. Let's figure out what their needs are. Let's qualify them, make sure that they even want to take action. Right. So there's the right way to do your early stage information gathering versus the wrong way, which is like, they want a demo. Great. Let me just show you 75 clicks and features and buttons. Right. So yeah, there's a right and a wrong way to run your process. And those are techniques and tactics. Those are things that you teach and that I teach every day. But ultimately, if the fear or the anxiety we're trying to get over is like, I'm a founder that's never done selling. I'm a CFO or a consultant or a B2B tech startup founder, and I've got to like sell. Like, well, let's just take the anxiety out of it. Let's just break it down, map it out, treat it like a process. Because most people, if you're a consultant or a CFO or an engineer that's built a great product, like, you're probably pretty good at process. You just follow the process, and at the end, you're going to know how you control the sale and how you get somebody from interested to paying customer.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what I really love about the approach you have is the world we're moving is constantly getting more data-driven and analytical. And obviously the examples we've talked about, you can actually boil them down to analytics. And I think it's something that people often think about when they think of sales. And I think we've already used the term that the black box of stuff goes in and then a certain amount of it falls out. Whereas, yeah, that's kind of true when you're a one person selling sometimes. But over time, it can turn into a science, and it can turn into this many calls or this many demos or this many whatever will result in this many of the next step and this many of the next step. And I suppose my question now, though, because you've really talked about the structure and having that process really kind of nailed down is I'm curious to see when someone is a founder, they're selling, and they hit that point where they need to get a team member. They need to bring someone on. How do they take that out of their head, put it into a process, get the right person, and where do they start? Should they start with I know you didn't like the term closer, so let's call them an implementer.
Yeah.
Should they start with an appointment setter? Should they start with the LinkedIn? Yeah. What are your thoughts there?
Sure. Lots of thoughts. I think the most important thing to think through, and this maybe goes back to some of the mistakes that founders make, is like one mistake they make is they don't sell their product, right? The second, which obviously implies like you got to go do the selling. Now, on the other hand, the second mistake that most founders make is they don't get help soon enough on the sales process. You're like, well, aren't you saying two different things? Or aren't you saying the same thing about two sides? And really what I mean by that is, you got to go do the selling. You got to figure out how to find customers and convert them and make them happy. Get those first 10 or 15 or 20 customers, get a couple $100,000 in revenue so you know what that looks like. Strip away the cover of the black box and see kind of the rudimentary pocket watch that's working here, so to speak. But as soon as you start to see how that works, then what you need to do is start extracting yourself out of certain parts of that sales process. So what we mean by that is the mistake that a lot of founders make is that they try to jump from startup mode to like scale up. Like, oh, we got 10 customers and we're doing $300,000 a year in revenue. Let's scale to 10 million. Well, before you make that big of a jump, what you've got to do is think about, well, what are some of the core processes that I'm running every day that's probably taking up a lot of my time, but I know that work really well. So it could be around lead gen. So if I know, okay, now I've crafted some emails and an email sequence, or I'm using LinkedIn in a certain way, or I know if I run a webinar once a month and I invite the right people, coming out of that webinar, we can book in some sales calls. If you start to see some basic repeatability, then the first thing you want to do is then find somebody that can start running that process for you. So in the sales world, you might think of it as a sales development rep. Somebody who's just going out and doing lead generation, lead qualification, and just inviting people so that you don't have to spend the time. You don't have to spend 4 hours a day on LinkedIn messaging people to get one or two calls. You're like, okay, if I send enough messages with the right messaging, we're going to get some calls. Cool. So let me just find somebody and teach them how to do that. And the same on the back end of the sale, right? With customer success and implementation. Like as a founder, you're probably, okay, I got the sale. Now I have to implement with the customer. Takes a lot of time. But geez, after we've done this a few times, we can start to see, okay, this is how we should train. This is how we should implement. These are the steps, week 1, week 2, week 4, end of Q1, this is where we should be. As soon as you start to get that mapped out, hire somebody to start running that for you. And it doesn't mean you completely disassociate with those parts of the business. You're probably still going to be somewhat involved. But what that does is it frees you up to do the thing that you're probably best at, which is actually converting the sales. Once you get a lead in, you can qualify them, do the demo, get them converted, and then hand them off to the customer success. So the first thing I usually recommend for people is like, number one, look for the repeatability that you've got in your process, find somebody to run those, and then you can start moving yourself up into the in your own organization.
The way I understand it, it's look for that repeatability at the beginning or the end of the model. So the beginning being the lead generation, wherever they come from, and the end being the customer success. And then once you've done that, I mean, this is the hardest thing. And you kind of touched on it before. People try and go from startup to scale up. And that, to me, what usually happens and what I see is they will build and scale a process before they know the process works. And that fundamentally just means you're doing something really efficiently, but you're still not sure if you should be doing it at all. So keeping that finger on the pulse and then build the process yourself and take a tiny part of it, the smallest part, the way I read this, the smallest part you can, get someone else to come and fit in, and then maybe expand their responsibilities, and potentially over time, you're able to replace yourself, but you're not trying to replace yourself with another founder, which really they should be running their own business. That's really cool. I like that how you start at the beginning and at the end, and stay involved in the middle. Makes a lot of sense. That's cool. So I kind of have a question then around when you when you're like even earlier stage, let's go really right back to the beginning. So we're talking about someone has a bit of an idea. They've possibly raised some seed funding. They're thinking about it. They might have the product. They probably don't have the product. Or they're thinking about a big pivot and a big change. When would you recommend people start selling and start engaging with actual legitimate potential customers?
So firstly, I'd say like in my experience has been like, until you have some customers, you're probably not going to get a seed round anymore. There's so much like pressure from investors, especially a seed round, to say, look, like you need to prove some level of systematic way of reaching the market. You have to prove what we call it, before you get to product market fit, we call it product problem fit. So in that early stage, like you said, you're coming, you're in the garage, you found a market, you think you found a market, you found a problem you want to solve. You've got this idea, you build version 1.0 or 0.1 of the product, your pre-MVP alpha version, whatever you want to call it. The first thing you got to do is assess whether or not do we have problem product fit. Like, okay, here's the problem, here's what we've built so far, here's what we're thinking about building, is there a match? And early on, some people call that customer development, where you're going out and interviewing your potential customers. I'm a believer of actually just going out and trying to sell, because the only way to know if there's value that gets exchanged is by people giving you money. People can say that they'll buy your product, people say that they'll be interested, but until you actually get them to pay you some amount of money, it could be $1, like literally $1. Anthony John calls it the penny gap. He wrote an article back in 2007, I think, in HBR, Harvard Business Review. He called it the penny gap, getting your early customers across that penny gap, because all kinds of things have to happen for them to give you money. Maybe they have to get approval. Maybe there has to be a contract. Maybe they have to figure out a way to fit it into the budget. Whatever that is, the only way we know if there's value as exchange is whether or not they give you money. So to answer your question, I would say, before you build the product, once you have some basic wireframes, go out and sell the concept of the product. We did this all the time when I was at Blend, simply because I've made a career out of selling stuff that didn't exist. I worked at 3 early stage companies, 2 of which we didn't even really have the product built before we were out there selling it. So in the ed tech space, selling to university professors at a company called Aplia, we had some basic, this is in 2002, we had like a flash version of this one product, and we'd show it to people and they're like, that's really cool. And like, great, would you like to try it for your fall classes? And they're like, yeah, I think I would. And then that meant that the engineering team had 6 months to like freaking build the thing. We did the same thing at Blend when we were selling to lenders. We went in there. I remember one very specific meeting we had. It was in January in New York, very cold, nasty day. And we go to like top of this high rise, and there's a top 5 lending company in there, the CEO, chairman of this very large lender. And the product we were demoing was a Flinto mockup. So if you've never used Flinto, you don't know what Flinto is. It's basically like a glorified PowerPoint. It's a way for you to build what looks like working software in this little rudimentary platform, so that when you click what looks like a button, it brings you to the next screen. So it's a way of making the product look like it works. And we knew we were 6 months away from actually having the working product. But because of the sales process, selling to one of the top 5 lenders in the country, we knew we had to start the process in January for us to even have a chance of getting a conversion in June, so they could start using it in the fall. So we walk into this room, and it's me and Nima, our CEO, Pranay, our product person, Justin, our head of engineering. And we're in there doing this demo, and I'm just thinking to myself the whole time, please don't ask me to push these other buttons, because I'm like walking them through the platform. And I'm like, if they ask me like, oh, what does that button do? The answer is like nothing, because there is no software here. And it was like scary as hell, but like it was the only way we were going to get some validation of problem product fit. And we had this lead in front of us. So yeah, it takes some chutzpah to go in there and do it. But like, if you confidently believe that the way you're solving the problem is unique to everyone else, those early customers, even if they find out like, oh, you mean the product's really not ready, it's not going to be ready for 3 more months, they should be cool with that. They should be excited about that. They should be the ones that go like, wow, we're going to be the first ones that get to take advantage of this platform. We're the ones that are going to help you influence the product roadmap. So those early customers are who you're looking for. And so as far as like answering your question, when to sell, like as early as possible. like today, now.
I have to ask, Scott, did that top 5 lender end up buying then or later on? Or
Yeah.
Did
they end up becoming
within
a customer.
the time frames?
Yep. Yeah, we ended up, we got a contract in the summer and we went live in a very small pilot with them in the fall. So yeah.
That's a story and a half there, man. That's awesome. I can just imagine like the giant overcoat.
I'm just like, please don't ask. Yeah. Oh yeah, the overcoat and the New York thing and, all that stuff. Yep.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. That's probably where we're looking to wrap things up then, Scott. So what I like to do, anyone who's been listening or kind of likes what they hear today, where can they find out more about you?
Best place to go, I'll just, for people watching, if you go to my website, salesqualia.com, what you're going to find on the homepage is a big button right in the middle. It says download now. So there's a book that I wrote last year, published it last year. It was an Amazon #1 new release, and it's called Stop Hustling, Start Scaling. And the whole premise of the book is exactly what we just talked about, Scott, which is like, what is a very basic framework that you could be following, building out your sales process at your company so you can stop hustling and get on that path of scaling up your company. So stop hustling, start scaling, ramp up your B2B startups repeatable revenue with the Q framework. So you can buy a copy on Amazon, but more so, I think, like, I don't really care about the royalties. I'm not going to buy an island in Fiji with it. So I'd much rather get this book into the hands of the people who need it, which is startup founders and early stage companies. So if you just go to salesqualia, QUALIA.com, you can just click download, pop in your email address, we'll send it to you. Plus, that'll also add you to our email list so you can find out about trainings and webinars and workshops and podcasts and all the stuff that we're doing every single week. So that's the single best place to go. Secondly, if you just search for me on LinkedIn, the only Scott Sambucci there. Just connect with me there.
I'll put both of those links below. So guys, if you want to go get that book, just click on the link below. And I also have kind of one bonus question that I don't mention to people.
Yeah.
Which is kind of based on what we've talked about, kind of that early stage B2B SaaS founder selling. What do you see as the future of that person and that role and that world? And where do you think that's going?
Ooh, big question. I think that person's going to become even more important as we get more complex problems, more complex solutions, more complexity that goes into how these solutions get built. I mean, if you just look at the natural progression of technology, I mean, take like a sort of a core technology like artificial intelligence, right? And there's lots of ways you can use AI, and you could use AI to build a certain product for a certain market. But from a customer standpoint, AI is new, right? They don't understand how it affects them. They don't understand how it could be used to solve their problem. So while I think marketing teams are doing a great job of adding more content that allows a buyer to do a lot more research, and all the data shows how much, 60, 70% of the buying process happens even before the salesperson gets involved. I would say when that salesperson does get involved, they're going to be one of the most important relationships that buyer is ever going to have, because that salesperson is either going to help them figure out if that product is the right fit. And if it is, and they help you solve that problem, then it all happened because that salesperson was really the keystone that bridged that research that buyers are doing on their own to actual implementation and getting them to the results that they're looking to get. So I'm a little bit biased, but people always feel like, salespeople are going away. I would say they're not going away. They're becoming more important than ever. They just need to be more specialized in their knowledge base and be able to communicate with prospects about their problems and walk them through a buying process that will allow them to get the outcomes that they want.
Scott, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for jumping on today. Anyone listening, watching, consuming, check below to learn more about Scott.
All right, folks, thanks for listening to yet another episode of the Startup Selling Show. As you can tell, we're pumping out as many of these as is reasonably possible. One of the things I frankly love to do is this podcast. It's a way for me to have a way to share my ideas, share frameworks, how we think about sales with other people like Scott Cowley, who had me on his show, as well as, of course, bringing in guest experts on different topics that we've done. and also resharing or reusing some of the content that we're sharing and publishing over on LinkedIn. So as we do LinkedIn lives, oftentimes we'll take those and republish them because I know it's hard to capture everything as you're seeing those in your LinkedIn feeds, or you might miss them. So it's a chance for us to reuse that content so you can get it. So you can certainly expect to see more and more of these episodes coming out in different forms and fashions, whether it's me interviewing an expert, me getting interviewed, or me sharing some different frameworks and sales perspectives with you. So that's it for now. I'm going to head back to my day. My new dog Shiloh is now standing at my office door telling me, she's saying, I've had enough of the office stuff. It's time to go take a walk. So that's what we're going to go do. All right. That's it for now. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time. See ya.